Sweet. Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the warm welcome. Definitely like huge shout outs for the CHCon crew for making this work when they said there were going to be remote talks. I submitted partially just to kind of see what happened, but I honestly figured they would get so many like Dynamite Live submissions that I'd get like a polite thanks but no thanks. And then they got back to me to be like, nope, we still want you to do it. And I was like, oh Christ, no, I'd have to do it. Um, if you haven't met me before, my name's Richö. They're right. I did run a couple of cons in Christchurch, although one of them was, I mean, one was low key and one was super impressively low key. But anyway, I'm here today to talk to what feels like an empty room, which is incredibly bizarre. But I'm going to talk quite a bit about base jumping, which I think is sort of an intuitively obvious subject for a hackathon. And I'm going to try and defend the thesis that my day job and tossing myself off of a bridge is basically the same thing with no like meaningful distinction. Um, cool. My next slide button. What? There we go. So this is like probably the best content warning I'll ever get to give in my whole life. So this talk does have like some pictures and videos of people doing rad stuff, mostly jumping off stuff. It also does have some shots of things not going great. No one involved in any of this was seriously injured or killed. In fact, miraculously, no one was even kind of hurt. But I wanted to at least like make sure that the warning is out there, that there is some content that's, I guess, a little bit rough to watch. All the videos have kind of a lead in, so if you want to look away, you'll like have your chance. I think the flip side of that is that there's also like a 30% chance you'll get to see one of my cats, which is something you don't get at every security con, which I think is kind of neat. And finally, there's also kind of like a fairly detailed depiction of some crimes, and I'm going to do my best to not go into too much detail or incriminate myself. But if I do, please don't let me go full Amon Ra. Cool. So, like, who am I? I've been doing computer security stuff for 10 years, which I actually realized as I was writing this slide, which was sort of horrifying. I work at a company called Lightstep now. If you need barrels of distributed tracing, hit us up. I do some open source stuff. I actually sort of forgot that I ran a couple cons until the intro. So, yeah, I did Wrong Island Con a few times. I've actually been kind of debating another one. So, nag me if that's the kind of thing you want to see. And those are my social media things if you want to see them. But I guess like more relevantly to this talk is what I do for giggles on the side. So I'm an aerobatic pilot. I actually just got my instrument rating last week, which is super useless when all you do is flips. But that's me flying my airplane upside down. I'm a skydiver. I have about 3,000 skydives. Specifically, I'm a canopy pilot. I competed at the World Cup of Canopy Piloting in 2019, representing Australia. I'm a base jumper. I have about 250 base jumps or so. I'm hashtag sponsored, which is clearly the end goal for all of these things. I speed fly. I'm a senior rigger. I used to race motorcycles. I do a lot of, I mean, I feel like I do a lot of stuff. And a lot of people would kind of look at this risk and want to label me as an adrenaline junkie, which I don't like really take issue with. But I think it's like pretty I think it's just misleading, right? Because my goal with all of these super ridiculous white people sports that I'm involved in is to go out and do awesome stuff and definitely like push limits and find out what's possible. But I'm also interested in continuing to do that. And if you die, it'll really kind of meaningfully impact your ability to do more rad shit, right? And so I kind of like reject this hypothesis that people do these things to experience nearly dying for the rush or whatever. I feel like the reason to do these things is so that you can go and do more of them. Cool. So I mean, this is like half a talk about base jumping and half a talk about security. I'm gonna tell you kind of the bare minimum amount of base jumping stuff that you need to know to get through this. So kind of bear with me. So like, what is base jumping? So base stands for building antenna span Earth. Spans are bridges. If that's not obvious, I guess they already had a B in the acronym, and babe jumping wasn't super appealing to them. But basically, like, I think the easiest way to put it is if you jumped out of an airplane of some kind, you're skydiving, and if you tossed yourself off a solid object, you're base jumping. Another really common definition is if it's possible to hit the object, you're base jumping. Base jumping was pioneered by Carl Bonish way back in the day, like in the late 70s. If you document having jumped one of each kind of object and write a letter to this dude called Rick Harrison. You get a number, mine's 2091. And so the implication is that I'm the 2091st person to have jumped all 4 kinds of objects. I think that's obviously not true. Like tons of people do it and don't write the letter, but it's kind of a fun little piece of history. And so what is hopefully the last little piece of like, I guess like base jumping or minutia for a hot second is how does a parachute work? Because it's going to kind of become relevant in a second. So when we're base jumping, we fly what's called a ram air parachute. When a lot of people think of parachutes, they think of a big round thing, probably with a little hole in the top, bunch of string going up to it. It's conceptually the same as tossing yourself off a roof with an umbrella, which I'm sure a lot of us did when we were kids. Round parachutes are bullshit. Like they still exist, but they're just horrific. They're super bad. They're steerable in the sense that you get to choose which way you're facing when you cream into the ground. And so these days we use what's called a ram air parachute. So it's rectangular. It actually forms like an aerodynamic wing. It has a lift vector. It does the whole thing. But instead of being rigid like an airplane's wing, which is made out of metal or fabric, it's made of nylon, and interior air pressure is what keeps it inflated and keeps it being a wing. Off the back of my parachute, this is a picture of me flying my parachute in Twin Falls, Idaho. The back of my parachute, you can see another smaller parachute, which is round and shitty. It's called a pilot chute, and when you execute a base jump, you throw the pilot chute catches air, it drags your main parachute out of the container. When you get to the end of your lines, it inflates, and now you're probably gonna live. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. Base jumping is super simple. The gear is really straightforward. There's only one parachute, so you don't have to deal with cutting away and stuff. Super straightforward. So I think I'm just going to get this like gimme out of the way because I feel like no talk about base jumping would be complete without it. I'm sure when you're a kid, your parents asked you, like, if your friends all jumped off a bridge, like, would you jump off it as well? And for me personally, the answer is absolutely. So this is Twin Falls, Idaho. I feel like this is what everyone came here to see. This is the only object that's legal to jump in the US. Neat little flippy-do. Parachutes opening. Bitchin' time. High fives all around. If you actually keep watching, I land about a meter away from that little bridge, which is what I was trying to land on. Which I guess, like in a context that probably seems pretty close, but in the broader context of base jumping, like if you just look at this landing area, we're off to the side, there's like boulders, there's trees, there's all kinds of shit. Being able to land super accurately is actually like pretty crucial to kind of successfully executing it. But for everyone in the audience, if you have never seen a base jump before, now you can say that you have. All right, box checked. But this is meant to be a talk about security, or at least like have just enough parallel to justify itself as one. And I think we've all heard, we've heard the expression, it's not life and death, probably in a professional context as well. And it's something that gets thrown around a ton. And I think like for the most part, I mean, it's accurate, right? Like very, very little that I've ever had to do in a professional context has been a matter of life and death. But for me personally, at least, a lot of the choices that I make in my personal life literally are. As an FAA parachute rigger, I'm privileged to pack other people's reserve parachutes. And so those people are literally putting their lives in my hands. And I think it does give you a really valuable perspective, for I guess, like, what really matters, but also for how you should manage risk and how you should be thinking about it in the broader context. And so one thing that I think you can take away from this is the next time you're making a decision in a professional context, like, stop and ask yourself whether or not you would have enough confidence in your decision to bet your life on it. Because it's something that people do on a day-to-day basis, which is sort of weird to think about. It still kind of trips me out some days. But I mean, it sort of is like a really bizarre position to find yourself in. And so I think as security practitioners, it's really, really easy to fall into the trap of always reaching for the safest thing, or I guess the lowest risk thing. And that's kind of like, I guess, reasonable in isolation. But if I were to apply that ethos to my personal life, I would have to give up skydiving, base jumping, or definitely stop flying small airplanes, probably stop owning a motorcycle, right? I would have to give up so much that I love. And at that point, I'd probably be asking myself, what's the point? Right? And so it comes back to this thing where, I mean, the goal is to do rad shit. And that's what I try and keep in mind in my professional life, is that my goal, you know, my function as a security person, like working for a tech startup, isn't to like say no to as much as I think I can get away with. I mean, my goal is to help the org do as like much rad shit as humanly possible, but do it in a way that's sustainable, right? Like if you teach yourself to base jump by buying a rig off eBay and tossing yourself off the nearest bridge, like I don't want to ruin the surprise, but you're probably not going to get to do a whole lot of base jumps. Same kind of thing when you're approaching risk in a professional context. You know, I mean, you want to do rad shit in a way that will let you do more rad shit instead of explaining yourself to the SEC or, you know, looking for a new job really hastily. So I figured the best way to kind of like relay this experience is I'm going to tell you a tale of two base jumps. And one of them actually took place in New Zealand, which is pretty neat. So there's this pretty cool bridge. It's somewhat famous. I'm going to do my best to remember to use the third person for this whole thing, because I'm telling you about a crime. But so there's this pretty famous bridge about halfway up the North Island. I think a lot of people have actually gone over it. It's like there's a passenger train kind of situation that you like spend a day or so on a train and you go over a bunch of fancy bridges, including this one. And so this is the story of someone who's not me and his buddy Steve, who decided that it would be a really good idea to toss themselves off this bridge. So this is what the bridge looks like from the top. Hang on, I think there's some way that I can get a cursor to point at things with. Oh, Jesus. Or maybe not. Oh, God. Here's where the technical... Okay, close enough. All right, so what happened is I also don't have a cursor, so I'm going to be like feeling this out. Normally, this is where a smarter person would use a laser pointer. So where are we? Oh God, this is going great. So this is where the party left their car with one of their girlfriends in it, who promptly went back to sleep. Took the car all the way around this like big windy road, came around the other side, peeled off into this kind of big scrubby grassland here. And one of the few really genuinely great decisions that got made that day was turning the car around, right? So it was facing out so that they wouldn't have to do like an aggressive 3-point turn on what is basically a swamp in a shitty front-wheel drive rental car. I guess like in the broader context of like figuring out whether or not this jump was a good idea, we have to talk a little bit about like the minutia of base jumping again. So I guess like the most important, or not the most important, but easily one of the most important things about scoping out a base jump is, oh great, now my slides don't go forward. There we go. Really? Clear. Yeah, all right. So how big is the object is like the first question that ever gets asked when you're deciding whether or not you're going to fling yourself off something. Right, and so you remember that picture I showed you earlier with the parachute and the smaller parachute hanging off the back? How fast you're going to be going when you deploy directly changes everything about the jump, right? So if the object is really small, like 150 feet is like pretty short for a base jump. Instead of using that little parachute as a parachute, you literally attach the bridle, which is the length of cord that attaches the two parachutes together. You attach it to the object, right, with some brake cord that snaps at 25 pounds. And then you jump off, it pulls you all the way until your lines are taut, and then it breaks and lets you go, right? So for really, really small objects, 150 feet is kind of about as low as most people go without specialized equipment. You're using a static line or someone else is holding your pilot chute. Use a huge pilot chute just in case it fails. You really set yourself up for success trying to open like as high as possible. Then there's this like 150 to 300 foot, I guess like no man's land where you hold the pilot chute. So you don't have it in a pocket, you don't have to throw it. You have it in your hand, you get off the object, you throw it as hard as you can, and then your parachute opens. And then once you get above about 300 feet, you can start to go what's called stowed. So you have the pilot chute kind of wrapped up, tucked into this pocket on your back. And then when you're ready to use it, you reach back, take it out of the pocket and throw it. And I guess to give you some idea of scale, this is a 42-inch pilot chute, right? And it's big. And this is I guess a medium-sized pilot chute. So it's a pretty substantial amount of fabric that you're trying to deal with. And that too will become relevant to this story. And then eventually you get into genuinely big objects like 600 foot plus, where you're taking long delays that's kind of long enough that you could fly a wingsuit off it. And you start using really, really small pilot chutes because you're going to be going fast as hell when you get there. So, oh god, this is an artist's rendition of the object in question. Obviously, the artist in question is super good at this. Um, but so it's 250 feet, right? Which is that first question that we ask. It's like, how big is the object? But the answer can be misleading. In this case, it's a bridge over a very sharp valley. And so while it is 250 feet to the bottom, as soon as you start getting offset from the bottom, it starts getting short really, really quickly. Potentially short enough that it's not enough room to like successfully execute a base jump. The walls of the canyon also just present hazard, right? Your parachute is meant to open on heading, but if it opens facing left or right and you just fly straight into the side of a cliff, it's not gonna feel very good. And finally, at the bottom of this particular valley, there's pretty nasty looking rapids. At least they really didn't look good that day. And so the expectation is probably that if you land in the rapids, you're in a lot of trouble. Maybe you'll survive, but I don't know that I'd be like super excited about the idea. And I guess the last thing is bridges are regarded as being, I guess, the safest object because you can't hit them, right? Like if you imagine a normal bridge kind of looks like this, there's nothing in the middle to hit. But this bridge had a ton of support towers or pillars, right? And so if you slam into the pillars, it's going to feel extremely not good. And so at the very bottom, kind of off to one side of the rapids, there was a little like gravel spit kind of situation, which represented like the only good place to land. And so I guess like if I were to use my grand old like rating scale for this jump, this is like 4 out of 10 scaries. It's not super duper on. It was kind of a lot of things working in our favor, but it was definitely a somewhat technical jump with a fair bit to think it out. And looking back on when this took place, at the time when this happened, I didn't have that many base jumps, right? And so I didn't have a really calibrated sense of risk, and I didn't have all the tools that I needed to really understand the risk that I was taking on when someone committed to doing this jump. So I'm going to talk for a second longer because as soon as I flip to the next slide, you're probably going to figure out what happened. So on that fateful morning, the two jumpers parked the rental car, went up to the top of the bridge. In this case, they'd spoken to someone else who jumped it, and they gave them what's called in base jumping circles beta. Climbers use the same term. And it's basically if you've done something before, you tell other people about your experience, and you'll be like, hey, this is where you want to park. This is how the hike out works. If the cops show up, this is a good place to hide. Whatever it may be, it's all the information that you can give someone to help them be more successful. And with 2020 hindsight, the person that these jumpers got their beta from was not as reliable as they potentially could have been. So they climbed up to the top, got to kind of the edge where you're officially like on a railway bridge. And you know that thing in the movies where you stick your ear against the train track, and if there's a train coming, the train tracks will vibrate and train tracks conduct sound. So putting your ear against the thing will clue you into whether or not a train is coming. That doesn't work. It is the short version of this story, right? The jumpers in question got a hold of that passenger schedule, and so like knew for a fact that there were no passenger trains scheduled. They sort of looked for the freight train schedule. It seemed, I think at the time it was pretty easy to write off. They were really struggling to figure it out. And considering that it was super early, we'd slept like crap. I had kind of forgotten that New Zealand gets quite cold in November. And so when I realized I was going to be sleeping in my car, I went to some shitty corner store and I bought all the Snuggies they had because that was the only warm thing they had, which was 2. And kind of realizing my mistake, I also bought all of their towels, thinking that's like basically a blanket. And so I was already off to a really roaring start, right? I slept like crap. I was super duper cold, and I just wanted to, or I guess they just wanted to get this thing done. Right, so ear to the train track, it's not vibrating, great. There's no possible way that a train is coming. Walk out onto the bridge. And so like we discussed, like the canyon is like a V, right? And so the closer to the middle you go, the safer this base jump is going to be. And like I've been alluding to, like there's no such thing as a safe base jump, but you're out of your skull if you don't stack the deck in your favor and try to make them as safe as possible. So they're wandering out, they're walking to the middle of this thing. There's a super technical base jumper move that you use to figure out what the winds are doing, where you just spit off the object and see where your spit goes. So they're spitting away happily, kind of watching the winds. The winds were fine. They were going, it was blowing, but it was like straight down the canyon, which is like kind of the best thing they could be doing in context. Oh, neat. The meeting's been upgraded by the host and now includes unlimited minutes. That's really good news if you want to hear the end of this. So wandering out onto the bridge, spitting off the thing, already kind of getting excited for how awesome this is going to be, because, you know, it's an iconic bridge and tossing yourself off stuff is super cool. So wandering out, doing the thing, and as I remember it, Steve looks up and says, "Is that a train?" And the other jumper in question looks up and says, I'm going to paraphrase, but yep, I think that's a train. And in that moment, there was a pretty serious decision to be made. And I will say, like, oh God, there's very little that I like haven't filmed in my career, of like doing ridiculous bullshit that I really genuinely had regret of. But I regret this one. This A would be a great teaching aid, but B, it would just be super cool footage. So there's now this train hauling ass at these two people, and they have a decision to make, right? Do you toss yourself off the bridge, having given up a lot of the, I guess, the safety that was cooked into this, which is the option to make a decision about whether or not you're doing it, or do you find out if you can run faster than a train? And the punchline to this is that every second you're contemplating what thing you're going to do, you're like losing valuable running away from a train seconds, right? And so, you know, back to this picture of the bridge, right? We had no idea if we were near the center. I mean, we had some idea, but the plan was to line ourselves up like pretty well with it. Didn't have a great sense of exactly how fast the train was going. It's difficult to figure out how long it's going to take before something gets to you. And the jump was pretty much predicated on having a clean and stable exit, right? Like if you leave kind of with your shit together and you leave symmetrical, your chances of having a really good opening and an uneventful canopy ride are a lot better. If you toss yourself headfirst over a rail because you're concerned about getting hit by a train, you've kind of given up a lot of that stability. And so you're rolling the dice pretty good. So I guess like now that you know a teeny little bit about base jumping, what would you do in this situation? I guess like show of hands for hop the rail. A few. All right. How about running faster than a train? And I'm assuming everyone who didn't vote is just like too smart to be on a rail bridge at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is kind of reasonable. So sorry, I think the video I have of the audience updates about once a second, so it's very difficult to read the room from here. So the people in question committed to running, and I think all things considered, that's probably the right call. I mean, given that I'm here to tell you the story, it's probably all right. But you know, it was an extremely committed decision, right? Like once you start running, that's your option. You know, Steve made it to the end of the bridge. The other person actually didn't. They wound up having to bail onto their stomach and let the train pass over them, which is a pretty, it's not a great position to be in. Not in the middle of the tracks, I guess. Like if you imagine train tracks and then there's like a gap off to the side and then like the train overhangs it, it was like off in that little part. But you know, it's not a really good feeling to have a train like hauling ass directly over you. And then, you know, the train kept slowing down and speeding up. My hypothesis is that the people on the train were deciding whether or not to get out and kick the shit out of the jumpers in question. But, you know, they hopped into the car, hauled us out of there. The driver had been living in the US for a fair while at this point. And so his mate Steve had to politely ask if he would drive on the left side of the road. Once they're a good minute or two into the drive, which I think was probably a good choice in context. And so there, you know, there's a lot to tease apart about this incident, right? Like obviously, this was like not a good example of like appropriately assessing and managing risk. Like any time where you nearly die in a brand new way you hadn't even contemplated when you were planning nearly dying, is probably not something that you're going to write off as a success. I guess the punchline to all this is that there's a catwalk, right? If you look at this picture, there's a beam that runs under the bridge and you can walk on it, right? And if we'd been under there, which is where we're meant to be, or where they were meant to be, the train passes overhead and you just don't care because you're in a different place, right? And this is where the person that they got the beta from, you know, I mean, obviously it's not their fault. Do what you can, you know, you take the information and make choices based on it. But had they known that you're meant to be on the catwalk under the bridge and not up on the tracks, this would be a pretty different story, right? And so, like, where did this all go wrong? This chain has like so many problems with it, right? Like, obviously not knowing about the catwalk is probably like I think the most crucial fuck up. Like, all of the other fuck ups combined were extremely survivable. The decision to be up on top of the bridge, like with the train, could absolutely have had like really, really dire consequences and could have been super horrific. Not having a concrete plan for what happens, like, given that they were committed to being up on top of this bridge, if they'd already discussed what they were going to do if a train came around the bend, this probably would have had a really different outcome, right? Because they would have had a lot more valuable time to execute the plan instead of making it as they went along. And I think this is one of the huge ones that I see, which is not only like having a plan, back to kind of the professional context where this is ostensibly a talk about, not only having a plan for when things are going really well, but deciding ahead of time, like, after you fuck this up, how are you going to dig your way out of that decision? Right. And so I think there's like two parts to this. Like, one is like we should have assessed the risks better, and the other is that we should have managed the risks better. We should obviously have known a lot more about the jump. We should probably have just decided to not do it for another day or two until we could have, better got the information. But we also should have made so many different choices around how we dealt with it. Right. And so I guess that's like a personal anecdote that I find pretty funny, although I'm seeing a lot of serious faces, about like how you can just barely survive making mistakes. But there's this analogy in base jumping saying you have a jar full of luck and a jar full of experience, right? And you have to fill the experience jar before you run out of the luck one. This was an incident that ate a lot into a luck jar. So the second incident that I want to talk about happened in Moab, which is honestly one of the most beautiful places on earth. These are some random pictures that I took last time I was in Moab. Moab's owned by the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, which is a really confusing acronym to overload right now. And so it's land that you can basically do whatever you want with. Their position is basically like, this is terrain that's for using, so like come and toss yourself off it, fly airplanes, drive jeeps, like do whatever, just try not to break it while you're here. If you're going to go forward driving, I highly recommend that you take an actual forward drive and not a rental Ford Focus, but that's a story for a different time. So I was at this jump called Welshman's, and Welshman's is pretty short. It's 180 feet. If you kind of remember that like scale of object height to scariness, 150 feet was about as low as you want to go without special equipment. So, I mean, it's like on the low side. Forgive the slow motion video, but this is what I guess like jumping with a static line, that device I talked about before that automatically pulls your parachute out of your container for you, kind of looks like. Right, so we're out at Welshman's. We're all having a really great time. We're not doing any crime, so we're allowed to do it in broad daylight with a large group of our friends. Everyone's having a blast. And my friend decides that he doesn't like the conditions. He feels that the wind through this canyon is excessive, particularly for a jump that's too low. And so he decides to not jump, right? Awesome, high fives all around. This is me talking a lot about making really good decisions. I'm super supportive of any time that someone is like, I don't like this, I don't think this feels right, I'm not going to do it, right? And making that hard decision to not jump is incredibly challenging in context, right? Because you've often been hiking for 4 hours to get to the exit point. The decision is like, do I jump and I land at my car, or do I hike for 4 hours in the other direction? It's really, really difficult to make that call sometimes. That was a good choice. I think the choice that they made next, which was to go to a different object nearby, really, really pushed things. And so this is inside footage. This is a base jump that doesn't go great. So if you're super squeamish, now's a good time to not look. He's fine. Like, miraculously, he's not even slightly hurt. But, fair warning. So this is a GoPro on top of my friend's helmet. He drove out. I was about to point, like that's helpful when I'm standing in front of the computer. He drove from where we were at Welshman's to this exit, which is called Funky Front. And you can see that he's in this big snaking canyon, but this canyon is like elevated, right? Like if you imagine the canyon, I'll shut up for a second so you can see this because it happens pretty quick. So as his parachute opens 180, he's flying directly to wall. And somehow, because he's the luckiest man in the universe, he lands on this tiny ledge that's exactly the same size as he is, right? And so having decided that he wasn't comfortable with the winds at one object, he then proceeded to climb a different object that had worse winds jumped, and as we can see, got incredibly lucky not to be seriously injured or killed. Happily, I mean, this is like such an incredible incident. There's also outside footage of it. So this was someone filming from the ground. I can't remember what he's yelling, probably something funny. And then credit where credit's due. Honestly, that was a ninja move. I mean, physics had kind of taken the wheel. He was a little bit of a passenger at that point. But if he'd done pretty much anything other than exactly what he did, we probably would have been visiting our friend in hospital instead of hanging out with him and drinking some beers like many hours later that night. Right. But this is another kind of classic story of like a failure to understand, assess, and like manage the risks. Right. Like at the point where you've made the decision that you don't like the winds, going from an object that's relatively sheltered to another object that's substantially more exposed and obviously is going to experience a lot more winds is a pretty dubious choice. And so there's these like local factors to his decision making, right, where he made the decision to go to something that, at least in my opinion, had a lower chance of going well. I mean, there's a reason why I jumped off the thing that I did. But there's also some very macro decisions. In this case, the jumper in question also had very limited skills in terms of like mountaineering and climbing and stuff. And so when he was rescued by actually quite a famous base jumper, she climbed down, handed him a climbing harness and said like, sick, here's the harness, here's a beaner, just rappel down. And he was like, I don't know how to rappel. Right. And if you're going to do base jumps in a really exposed, like very far from civilization location, like you should have some understanding of first aid, and of self-rescue and basically be in some position to help yourself out if it doesn't go well, because sooner or later it's not going to, right? The law of average is not on your side. But in this case it did. This is my buddy hanging out at the bottom of this jump, drinking a beer, telling everyone how lucky he is. I guess the punchline to this is that this event was actually a fundraiser for the search and rescue in Moab. And so A, we're kind of happy not to have to use their services because it'd be really embarrassing if our fundraiser cost more than it made. And B, the huge party that is the fundraiser is like further down the canyon. So literally everyone who wanted to get to the party had to drop by and offer some words of encouragement while he was a couple hundred feet up a wall. So it went well, but this is another case of going well, I guess, like in spite of his plans, not necessarily because of them. Sorry, I'm trying to find the very specific place that I have to click to advance my slides while also not being able to see my cursor. Right, and so like, how do I turn this around into a security allegory and not just a series of stories about doing rad stuff with parachutes? I think it's really crucial to have the whole picture. And I mean, it's super corny. It's fundamentally a TED talk, right? To say that base jumping has changed the way I approach risk in a professional context. And I don't think like everyone needs to go be a base jumper so they can like be good at stopping computer hacking. Like that's obviously absurd. But I think it is worth having that perspective that at the end of the day, the goal is to go out and do awesome stuff in a sustainable way. And I think a ton of people do like really lose sight of this. And so I think, if having a checklist really actually helps you to like measure the risk, there are tons of them like for flying and for base jumping and for a bunch of the other stuff that I do. And I don't love them. Like I just talked for 30 minutes about how it's super crucial to have a plan and to write things down and to manage your risk. And now I'm going to turn around and be like, well, don't write it down unless it's super helpful for you, because the frameworks that help you like attach a number to it are always going to be super flawed. And it's human nature to to extrapolate from the data what you want to see, right? Like you'll be able to turn that number into a go decision if that's what you really want to do, right? And that's exactly what happened to the people involved in both of those situations. There was a lot to say, don't climb onto this rail bridge. Like this is not going to go well. There was a ton to say, like at the point we've decided to not jump tonight, like just don't jump tonight. Like go to the party, have a beer with your friends. It's like, it's fine. You don't have to go and do a base jump. In both of these cases, they didn't make that decision. So while it's super crucial to like make these go decisions, it's also really crucial to like detach yourself from that decision as much as you possibly can. And if you can, write down what that criteria is before you start. So I guess to finally wrap things up, do rad shit. That's absolutely what I'm getting at here. Like, get into base jumping if that's something you really want to do. Like, go grind out those 200 skydives and toss yourself off a bridge. But if you're gonna do something awesome, whether it's tossing yourself off a bridge or releasing a scary product or whatever it may be in the context of your your day job, you should have a convincing explanation for why it's probably going to go fine, right? Like it doesn't have to be bulletproof. There is a reason that the risk assessment involves confidence intervals and averages and stuff. But if you can't clearly articulate why you're fairly confident this is going to be all right, I don't know, it's probably not going to be all right. And I guess the other takeaways is like take more selfies. I used to like really kind of take issue with people who like took shitloads of selfies. And now I take as many as I can. And like tell your friends you love them because life's short. So I don't know what the deal is with Q&A. I know there's a Discord. I think I finished 8 minutes early. I can't remember what time I started. I'm either 8 minutes early or like 23 minutes early, which seems unlikely. But the good news is I talk too fast like a dumbass and now I have bonus content. So what's at like the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like I talked a lot about like, I guess what I would regard as being a premeditated bad decision, right? Like you have lots and lots of time to figure out whether or not what you're doing makes any sense. And then it culminates in a go, no go decision. Most of the like period where you're figuring out what you're doing with your life, it is pretty slow and pretty opt-in, right? Like at any point you can bail out. Some of the stuff I'm involved with is way at the other end where you basically build yourself up to what is nearly a very bad decision. And then you figure out whether or not it's going to go really well. So I mentioned that I compete in the dumbest sport ever called swooping. So this is me flying a parachute past the ground and my friend at about 80 miles an hour. And the rollout on that was about a foot off the ground. And the nearest thing I had to the ground was my tailbone. So you can probably kind of do the math on what happens if you get that wrong. And there's some margin for error. I'm not trying to imply that every time I do this, I nearly die because I would definitely be dead by now. Also, this goes really, really well for me every single time, apart from the one time I broke my back. But, you know, this is like way at the other end where, yeah, I've like done a bunch of mitigating. This is what that looks like from the inside. This is with the camera attached to my helmet. You know, I spent a whole bunch of time like figuring out how to do this as safely as possible. But the reality is like, I mean, the last half a second of this, things are happening pretty quick and it's kind of down to like physics at this point. Like there's an old expression like the skydive's not over when you're done with it. The skydive's over when physics is done with you. And kind of managing that part of the risk also, I run like a clown. It is really, really challenging because this definitely gets out into the far reaches of the unpredictability of the situation that you find yourself in. And I think this also kind of crops up a ton, you know, in our lives as security people where there is a ton of like, yeah, I mean, what do you do with those black swan events, right? Like in this case, like turbulent air can really have a huge problem with you. But, you know, if you have bet the farm on like open SSL is good, which was like a super reasonable position to take like before 2014, you know, sometimes things are just going to happen. And again, it comes back to this ability to have at least contemplated what your plan is when it all goes wrong. Because those valuable seconds that you spend executing your plan instead of inventing one are probably going to be pretty significant in the grand scheme of things, right? Like your decisions like add up. So I have one more video of me just doing stupid shit because at this point, this was literally bonus content in case I talked way too fast. And then I think they kind of implied that maybe I can try and do live Q&A, but there's probably someone really pale behind the sound desk now as I suggest that. So I guess like to wrap up with the dumbest white people sport of all, this is called speed flying. So it's like halfway in between. I guess you take your parachute, you run off a cliff with it already inflated, and then you see how close you can come to hitting the cliff as many times as you can on the way down. This used to be a hill that was about 10 minutes from my office. So this is how I spent all of my days after work. So awesome. I've been Richö Butts. This has hopefully been good. I will freely admit that it's incredibly unnerving to just talk at a desk for 45 minutes in front of a camera that's not updating super often. You've been great. Thank you.
All right.